Hi, everybody. Welcome to the sixth episode of our online seminar series called Revisiting 10 Key TANTlab Papers. It is going to be recorded and published on the TANTlab's YouTube channel. And for those watching this on YouTube, hi, this will have been a live interview. My name is Mathieu Jacomy. I am an engineer and assistant professor at the TANTlab. I am also one of the three hosts of this seminar series. The two other hosts are Matt Artz, who is in Philadelphia, where he works as an AI product manager and sets the trends in the American field of applied anthropology, and Torben Elgaard Jensen, professor of STS and leader of the TANTlab, who also happens to be the author of today's paper. So why are we doing this seminar series where we are revisiting 10 key TANTlab papers one at a time? That's because we believe that these papers raise discussions rather than settle them. Since 2012, even before I was at the TANTlab, it has been right in the thick of conversations about digital and participatory methods and how to practice STS and anthropology of technology in our increasingly computational world. So we begin each of these seminars with an author interview. Matt will interview one of the authors of that day's paper. So today the paper has only one author, and it's Torben, to tease out how they think about the issue raised in the paper and how this issue may perhaps have moved and look differently today. After the interview session, we will invite all of you to join the discussion. Before handing over to Matt, let me briefly introduce today's paper. It is from 2024, and it introduces the Slalom Method to the world. It was published in the journal Qualitative Research. Torben is its single author. The full title is The Slalom Method: How to Zigzag Between Digital Methods and Traditional Methods in Ethnography. So once again, welcome to this seminar, and I will now hand it over to Matt.
Thank you very much. All right, well, thanks all for joining. So Torben, to get right into it, first, I want to say, as I've sort of hinted at or said in some form in other sessions so far, one of the things I really like about the TANTlab papers is the ways that you make, sort of the knowledge production visible. And in this paper particularly, I think you are, very honest about some of the frustrations you experienced as you were going through trying to think about how to integrate this sort of digital data in with the more conventional ethnographic data, and very much appreciate that, because I think all of us have experienced that frustration, and to be able to see that in others and identify with that and know that everybody's not alone, I think is always a great service to to all the readers out there, and provides fruitful kind of conversation. And so with that in mind, I think when reading this, even though the paper is relatively recent in the grand scheme of things, a lot has changed, right, in only a year plus. And more people are playing with AI today, which means that more people are using sort of natural language interfaces to carry out digital methods that they may have never even touched in the past, thereby not only engaging with new methods, but in many cases even producing new kind of strange data objects, as you mentioned in the paper. So I'd like to maybe start there with the data object concept and just ask you, know it's only about a year, but has anything changed in your thinking about that? Is it more complicated today than it was previously? Is there any lessons learned that maybe you've come across in the past year that everybody should be thinking about?
Yeah, that's a good question, Matt. I think I'm actually very much in line on what you're saying, that so many new opportunities are popping up all the time. So just last week I was to a lecture with Lorraine Dastan, who's a 74-year-old, very esteemed historian of science. And when she was making her argument and drawing back on material from 15 and 1600s, she was also from the side throwing in some stuff that she had taken from Ngram viewers, Ngram viewer, the device from Google, where you can see what is the prevalence of particular words in in all the books ever published. So for an increasing number of people, we can access interfaces and data in a quick and efficient and interesting way, and draw them into our arguments. So I think for that reason, it's just this opportunity, but also this problem about how to integrate data in meaningful ways just grows and grows and changes and evolves in interesting ways.
Great, thanks. Yeah, certainly seeing that, and want to get into that a little bit more, but maybe just to very also quickly step back and set some context. So, there's a tie-in for you with the psychology department in this paper. So you would mind maybe just giving us an overview of how the paper kind of came to be, what your relationship was there, and then maybe from there we can get more into the sort of the methods and the integration problems.
Yeah. So sometimes I describe myself as a closet psychologist. So I have a psychologist background, but I keep it secret because now I'm an STS scholar. So I'm sometimes almost a little bit embarrassed about it. But from 1987 to 1995, I was a candidate in the psychology department in Copenhagen, and later I was a PhD student in the same place. And then I kind of left the building wanting to be an STS researcher and got jobs elsewhere. And I didn't stop hanging out with psychologists and stopped reading that kind of stuff and being part of that discussion. But then in 2012, sort of as almost like a voice from the past, an old friend from the department who was at that time had become associate professor, his name was Morten Nissen, called me and said, hey, we are doing this interesting project, and I hear that you're doing science studies. Why don't you come and do science studies on us? So suddenly I was invited back into the old world of psychology, but now being invited as an anthropologist of science who could study those people that I knew from the past, but now with a new perspective. So that was, of course, extremely tempting for me and fascinating, and a wonderful invitation to be able to go back and study the psychologist, but from a new perspective. So that was the background for that. So on the one hand, I felt very well prepared for this field work because I had all sorts of background knowledge about psychology and psychologists and the people in that department and the conflicts in that department. I also used to be involved in student politics around that department. But on the other hand, I had sort of since that, grown into STS, and I had become a leader of the organizational unit that would become TANTlab. So with a lot of super interesting people who were working with digital methods and anthropology and STS in interesting ways. So I was sort of being invited back to study the psychologist, but at the same time, I had the opportunity to connect that to my new world of digital methods and STS in the Techno-Anthropology lab. So the paper has grown out of those sort of two alliances or being in the middle of that.
So what strikes me as interesting about that is it's somewhat ironic that the paper you write on the struggles of connecting, right, the digital data, with the ethnographic data is something that you are so deeply entrenched in, or at least historically, which maybe only more speaks to the challenges of integrating that. And you speak of the four problems: problem of priority, of integration, of digital data quality, and of logistics. So you want to maybe just kind of get into a little bit of that context and help, everybody listening kind of understand those four?
Yeah, so the way this sort of work evolved for me was that first I went into the psychology department, and I sort of cooked up this account about what they were doing. I have this phrase that I call it that they're engaged in the gradual renewal of shared conceptual repertoire, which means that in common terms that people out in the world are having mental constructs or concepts of various sorts, and those concepts form how they think about psychological problems in all sorts of ways. And the psychologists were interested in sort of reforming those concepts, or engaging with them, or supervising people who were working with psychological problems. So this was the starting point that I understood them in this particular way. And later I tried to sort of relate digital methods to that. And then I struggled to figure that out. But then when I had to write the paper, it struck me that, or to be honest, reviewers struck me in the head with the fact that some people would say, but that's just mixed methods. You're just doing mixed methods, and there's a huge literature on that you need to relate to in some kind of way. So a major difficulty for me writing the paper was to explain to the readers what is this mixed methods? Is it just mixed methods all over again, or is it in a different way? And the key to explaining that was to say that what I'm doing here is ethnography, which means an iterative, opportunistic research project, and mixed methods tend to be a fixed research design. So that's why I'm writing so much about, or starting with the discussion relating to mixed methods. So that was a long roundabout. Let me try to sort of, specifically answer, what is it I'm saying with those first, what I outlined in the paper, a series of foreseeable problems when you try to combine different kinds of methods. And what I'm saying is that there is the first thing that happens when you have quantitative and qualitative methods, or digital methods, and traditional ethnographic methods, is that you might have a problem of priority. Some people would say that qualitative methods are more reliable. So, for instance, they would say that you need ethnography to establish ground truth. And what you get from digital methods is more like a satellite image of something, but you need to figure out for real what it is about by doing proper ethnography. Others would take it the other way around and say that ethnography are just pretty arbitrary little stories, but you need to have broader surveys to understand what is really going on. So that's the first problem, that you need to figure out the priority of methods. Which one do you believe in the most? And the take of the Slalom method is, of course, not to settle that beforehand, but to figure it out on the fly, or not to make one method the final judge of any other. So to keep that open would be good ethnographic practice, and that's also what the Slalom method recommends. And then there is a problem of data combination, which is about how do you fit these things together. And the brief answer of the article is to say that what you need to keep in focus at all times is that you have some kind of understanding or conception of what you're studying. So at all times I had an idea about how would I explain how the psychologists are constructing knowledge, and that conception needs to be sort of evaluated, iterated, and improved along the way. So the way you integrate methods is to say, can you add another method to improve that understanding, or qualify it, or perhaps challenge it in important ways? So it's not like there is a recipe for how methods will fit together, but if they can push your understanding further, then you're using them or integrating them in a meaningful way. And then there are additional problems about data quality, which I also sort of recommend that is solved sort of related to the specific case. So in certain instances, you might have not so clean and so proper data, but still, if you can improve your understanding of the things, you might be able to use it. And finally, there's a problem of logistics, which are all those, for field workers, always practical concerns about where do you put your efforts. And again, the recommendation is put your efforts into digital methods if they can push your project further, if they can qualify your understanding of what you're studying. But if not, spend your time on something else.
Right. Thank you. Thanks for all that context and the breaking down um, the four sort of points of integration there. And so there are also some house rules that you recommend to sort of help sort of steer people through there. And I want to get to those over time. Um, but just on the last point of logistics, just because that goes back to something that I said at the outset, logistics may seem it's fairly obvious in the sense that it's right, the sort of time needed to sort of get up to speed. But that's becoming maybe again in the context in the moment that we're in a significant problem because the amount of approaches, methods, opportunities for creating boundary objects, all of that is sort of exploding for many people, right, in ways that they didn't have previously. So any guidance on that for people who are just getting into working with digital methods and, how they should allot time, how they should upskill?
Yeah, see, I I think it's easy to think that there are just a lot of tools available out there, and it's true that there are tools available out there, but at the end of the day, the way we use these tools is very much dependent on having colleagues or knowing others, being part of communities that can help you, give you good examples or help your usage of it and so on. So I think it's I mean, while it's true that there's so much out there you could use, then at the end of the day, we also have to build practical communities, find colleagues, people to talk to get inspiration about how to use all the digital tools out there. So I think that's an important part of it. And if I had to give another recommendation, I mean, always try something simple before something complicated. I think there is some people who have sort of heroically thrown themselves into, say, learning Python programming or other complicated stuff. Those of us who are their colleagues are grateful that they did it, but it's a huge investment of time, and so in order to, if you're sort of dedicated to understanding some field that you're studying, then you really have to be pragmatic about your time and pick some tools that are available, that are fairly easy to use, but I think in a sense, the worst thing you could do is to say that, okay, digital methods is an aim in itself. I mean, it needs to be a tool for understanding some kind of problem or getting a deeper insight or designing something. So what the Slalom paper is essentially a call for is to sort of keep your nose in the track in terms of what is it, try to always clarify what is it you're trying to understand and explain. So if you so another, to take a slogan from Aalborg University, I mean, we have the slogan about being problem oriented. So that's also a good reminder. Always focus on what is the specific problem we're trying to solve, rather than say that particular methods or approaches in and of themselves have a higher importance or value. But on the other hand, if you can focus on a problem, then you can really make the method shine, both individually and in combination, I think.
Great. Good recommendation. And so appreciate that. Now to put that in some context, and I do want to get to the house rules and talking about, how you decide sort of when to pivot. But just to put that in context, so you chose, citation data to help sort of unpack this gradual unfolding. You want to maybe just briefly elaborate on that?
Yeah. So I had this idea that the psychologists, the game they were playing was that they wanted to gradually change the conceptual repertoire of people. But then it struck me that I had no idea what is a gradual change. I had no way to quantify that or measure that. So maybe it was just like a vague, fluffy statement that I come up with. And in order to substantiate that, I found that I could get help from digital methods, and the idea I came up with was to pick in the group of psychologists I was studying and in a neighboring group, which they happen to be in conflict with or hate, which is common in psychology departments. For each of these groups, I picked sort of a key article that a lot of papers were citing, um, and uh, and then this sort of cluster of articles that was citing this key article, I could use some software to detect what kind of concepts were they using, or theories, or problem fields were they referring to, and then I could see in that cluster of articles how did that change over time, and then I could compare the two groups. So suddenly I had a measure for are they talking about the same concepts, for instance, for decade after decade, or is that gradually changing, or is it perhaps rapidly changing? And then I discovered that amongst the cognitive psychologists, there was a very rapid turnover of both theories and concepts that was shifting that quite rapidly, whereas the cultural historical psychologists, which were my target group, they only had a gradual change. They had a change all the time, but a gradual change of the concepts they were using. So that was how I used those bibliographical data.
Right. Thank you. And now maybe we can talk about, pivoting, using this sort of adjective as, and the concept of this gradual change to think about as a moment of pivot, and then also, thinking about how you pivoted back. And would you mind sort of now maybe unpacking, your thinking at the time of going through the slalom method and again, why you pivoted when you did?
Yeah, so I discovered that there were certain moments that I perhaps got stuck with one method, or or found out that I could learn more by switching to a different method. So the first moment was when I was sort of deep in traditional ethnographic methods. I found out that I had this idea about it's a gradual renewal of concepts. That sounded nice, but I was unable to sort of clarify that more. But then by doing this bibliographical study, which is more digital methods like, I could sort of try to learn more about what could gradual be, or how could you understand that. But that rendered me with an image of one group of psychologists with a quick turnover of concepts and one with a very slow turnover. And I was not able to explain that immediately from the data. So that induced me to go back to the ethnographic methods to review my interviews and dig into how do they again relate to their fields of study. And there it struck me that the cognitive psychologists are essentially doing laboratory science where they can sort of shut the doors and do whatever they like within that context in terms of shifting theories and concepts. But the cultural psychologists were engaged with problem fields out there in the world. So they were, for instance, supervising people who were working in particular institutions or teaching them, and they were being invited to give presentations and participate in public debates and so on. So for that reason, the concepts they were talking about were deeply connected to all sorts of other practices and actors out there. So for that reason, it made sense that they couldn't just shift them overnight or shift them very rapidly. Instead, they had to be committed to that whole context, and try to change that as a part of changing their concepts. And then finally, I discovered that in the interviews they talked about how they sort of promoted their concepts, or how they connected with other actors. And then it struck me that maybe there was a bigger pattern there about that, for instance, their teaching activities or their course activities or other stuff, and I would be able to trace that using digital methods. So that was sort of a final idea I developed but didn't follow up on in the paper. So the story here is that that there were moments in the fieldwork where I had sort of preliminary conclusions or hit stumbling blocks with one method, but then I could turn to another method and qualify my understanding about how the psychologists were working and how they were constructing knowledge. And each time it was sort of the shift between methods that helped me get further in the project or get a deeper understanding.
Thanks. And so, to say that back and maybe tie it to one of the house rules for a second, right? So you have this sort of fuzzy understanding of this gradual process, pivot to a digital method to try and dive deeper, illuminate that a bit. You get to the point where you have the citation graphs or charts that look fairly, almost, opposite of each other in many ways. Pivot back, make sense of it a little bit further. And in doing that, sort of for me relates to the one house rule, of no final judge. And so, right, if there is no one final method, I guess, how do you know when the pivoting is done? Right? For you, what was the process of sort of coming to, a final place of understanding?
Yeah, that's a really good question because in principle you could go on and on. I think there's a very pragmatic answer here, which is at some point you need to finish the project and write whatever understanding you have, and then others can, problematize that and write the next thing. I think that is really the practical answer. But I think there's also I think the lesson I drew from this is that actually after the first period of field work, I could have written a paper just celebrating my insight there. Because I also presented it to the psychologists and they said, yeah, that's a pretty good description of what we're doing. I mean, it could have ended there, but I think by including digital methods, I was able to sort of keep the iteration and the reflection going. So I think that's the really big opportunity with digital methods or in principle any other methods or types of dialogue that if you can just sort of poke a hole in the satisfaction you might feel when you think you have reached a conclusion and keep the iteration going a bit more, then that's a good thing. But also obviously a painful thing because it's it hurts to change the beautiful narrative that you have written at some point. So the answer is, where do you end? I think there's no good answer to that, but I think there should be an obligation to keep the iteration going as long as possible as you can within the projects, because it is easy to find some narrative that sounds good early in the project and stick with that, especially if your informants tell you that it's pretty okay.
Great, thank you. And now I mentioned the house rules there, and I do want to get to them and call them out in just a second, but just very quickly, hanging on this sort of larger topic that we've had of integration, of pivoting through the slalom method, picking, when to know what is right. There is also a brief, but I think important distinction you make in the paper related to triangulation, where, that's pointing to, in many ways, corroborate, certain findings versus sort of your qualification concept. And so for those who, maybe missed that, maybe have, we'll see the video, haven't you read it? You mind just sort of teasing that out for us?
Yeah. So one of the things you can find in the mixed methods literature is this idea of triangulation, which is, and they talk about both method triangulation and data triangulation, and the metaphor here is something like witnesses in a court case, where if you have three independent witnesses that saw something, then you can establish that as a fact. And if that happens, that's of course nice, both in court cases, but also in in research that if things corroborate each other in a neat way, then you have established something. But the practice is that both, and that's also the practice in court cases, often witnesses say different things that are not that easy to reconcile. And the same thing, you could have different methods and they just speak about partially different things. So it's not, triangulation is not, it can sound like a panacea or a standard solution for something, but it really is not. So instead of sort of hoping that digital methods and anthropological methods would come together in some kind of nice point and just end up corroborating one specific facts or specific sets of facts, then my argument is that perhaps instead we should look at them as sort of constantly challenging, like in the way in a conversation where sometimes you or hopefully you end up at a better place, not necessarily by converging, but by pushing each other in meaningful ways. Uh, so that's why I'm sort of arguing for sort of an odd and a constant push for qualifying the description of what you're studying instead of triangulating and assuming that it will all converge towards one point.
Okay, thanks. Now, with all that said, given given the very iterative, performative sort of nature of all this, to help guide you, you did say some house rules for yourself. Methods should be combined iteratively. No method should be the final judge, and the value of the method is defined by its ability to qualify the conception of the field at a particular stage. So, one, I want to open it up just to ask, do you want to say anything about any of those? But maybe more to the point of what I want to ask is, have any of those changed for you? And would there be others? You do note in the text that they may be different for different projects. So I guess I'm wondering if you've come up with any others based on different projects, or if you would suggest some way of, other researchers thinking about creating their own house rules.
I think so I make a distinction between house rules, which are sort of more fundamental principles for the Slalom method, and I think I would I'm sort of in the age where I can sometimes be a stubborn old man, and I'll be a stubborn old man on those and stick with those house rules. I think they're still sort of valid ways to think about methods. But then there is a different set of rules which are called the rules of thumb, and those are the types of indications that we could find in a project that it's time to shift from one method to another. And I think and what I suggest in the paper is that the rules of thumb could be extended with the experiences of other projects. Indeed, I would welcome that very much. And I've come across other papers. There's one by Anders Bloch and a number of co-authors called Stitching Data Together, where they talk about also an experiment in combining ethnographic work and big data work. And it surprised me that in a sense they have some implicitly the same rules of thumb that I have. They detect big strange patterns in the big data, and then they go to the ethnographer to explain that, or the ethnographer observes something which has an adjective. They talk about the intensity of a party. Is it happening or is it dying out? And then they try to look at that in the big data. So there are many things that are similar, and I think one possible new rule of thumb in general could just be that if you work with a method and you feel you have come to a conclusion, then it's worth simply trying other methods to see does that conclusion stand up, or is it possible to qualify it or change it in any way? But I think the house rules, the prescription not to prioritize one method and to evaluate the quality of method by what it can offer at a specific point, I think I would like to stick to those, at least for now. But maybe the conversation now will continue could convince me otherwise. I don't know.
Sounds good. Let me ask maybe one more, and then we'll open it up. So on this in this study, you were a team of one. It's fairly easy for you to decide when you want to pivot, right? It's only up to you to make that call.
Mm.
How about if you were to scale this, to a team of researchers working on a project? Any thoughts on, how that might work within a team setting? Would anything change? Do you think everything stands up?
That's a super good question. I haven't thought about that. I think so. What I'm implying is that I have at all times sort of an updated sort of the best version of my description of what the psychologists are doing, and that thing can be gradually changed and improved. But obviously, in a project, it would require work to have sort of a common understanding. So it's a practical matter of how do you organize your dialogues and your writing within a project. And also in a project, you have the benefit of a division of labor and different kinds of competences and interest and so on. So I could, in principle, I mean, what could go wrong in a project, of course, is that you fraction into a number of different understandings and each have their favorite method. But what could definitely go very well is that if you manage to keep a strong internal dialogue, then there would be an even greater opportunity to keep qualifying and changing or challenging whatever understanding you have of a field. So and I think the article I just mentioned before, they were actually a group of people, I think 4 or 5 people, including the anthropologist on the ground and the big data guys looking at at all the signals they got in from various sources. And I think they, in a very neat way, managed to have a dialogue about how to combine the different things with each other. It was a project called the Social Fabric Project at the University of Copenhagen.
Great, thank you.
Yeah.
So we're pretty much at a time where we should probably open it up to others. Anybody want to jump in with a question?
I will then. So when I was a PhD student, I was in a course, following a course on mixed methods. And one of the papers I read there was called Mixed Method Research, Positivism Dressed in Drag, question mark, by Lina Giddings. And so her point is that for her, mixed methods continues the hegemony of positivism, her words. But essentially, I take it as she thinks that it boils down too often to the qualitative being a little bit of flavor added to a mostly quantitative thing. Now, I will not ask how the slalom method is different from the mixed method because you developed that in the paper, although you are very welcome to comment on this. But I wanted to know what, in your opinion, is protecting the slalom method from becoming the same thing. I just said that because I believe that mixed methods they were well intended. I don't see that as a trick of the quantitativists to assert their hegemony. But regardless of whether or not it was the intent, it may have happened. But if that's the movement here, well intended but becoming something that is just continuing the hegemony of positivism, what in the slalom method is protecting us from this?
That's that's a good. I think the at least my implicit message with the slalom method, and also explicit, I hope, is to really hold on to the key knowledge project of ethnography or anthropology. To say that the right way to generate knowledge is to go into the field, be open to serendipity, to be iterative, to be reflexive, and to be clear about what you're doing and to sort of gradually develop your understanding of something. And I think mixed methods is such a big business that it's impossible to say something in general about it, at least for me. But I think what I see a lot is sort of something that is sort of it's a type of project design that implies that, okay, first we will plan to do a survey and then we will do follow-up interviews or vice versa. So there is so mixed methods often do not go into the field, but it's more like a series of project steps. And also I get the sense that maybe this is a project that has grown out of conflicts in sociology departments where you have the qualitative and the quantitative people, and then with mixed methods they say that, okay, maybe we can come together in the same project. So it's a bit of an arranged marriage in a sense, whereas my project is saying that, it's based on the love of ethnography and the faith in that way of producing knowledge, and then I'm just ruthlessly applying digital methods and everything else to further that specific project. So I'm saying that iteration should be the driver, or an ethnographic type of curiosity. So I don't know if that makes it I think it's more perhaps you could say it's not positivism in drag, but it's more like a hermeneutic understanding in drag. So it's a hermeneutic understanding that dresses up with whatever is available on the shelves, including digital methods or quantitative methods or traditional ethnographic methods. So I would resist saying that the Slalom method invites positivism rather the other way around. It's perhaps a hermeneutic way of abusing any kind of method or using any kind of method available.
So just to follow up on that, would you then say, if I understand well your point, would you say that what protects the Slalom methods of that strand of the Slalom methods against positivistic hegemony, or whatever we should find a better name, but I will go for that for now. What protects it is that it demands a bottom-up research design, and if you abandon that and you accept to have a top-down research design that is decided in advance, then you will end up in that other kind of work.
Potentially. So some people would say that, okay, digital methods can give us some kind of honest signals. I mean, people don't say that anymore, but 10 years ago they might have. So with digital methods, we can have a more accurate description of social reality because it's more data and interesting data in all sorts of ways. And the Slalom method would say, well, let's see, let's try to develop an understanding of the field, see if that bunch of data can qualify that, perhaps not, perhaps it will open new questions and so on. The Slalom method refuses to, in a sense, recognize even the validity or the quality or the relevance of any kind of method beforehand. Instead, it would just like have its own priorities, and stubbornly insist that the methods should work for the project rather than the project should work for the methods.
Thanks.
Any questions? If not, I have maybe just a follow-up to that. For me, that particularly like how you ended there, it brings me back to the logistics question, because what it may actually raise is a scenario in which you realize you now want to go out and work with some method or with some presumed data set, and may not actually have the knowledge, right, or skills to maybe pull that off, and then raises the question, well, in that scenario, what might you do? you have a hunch that maybe that is the path you need to go, but don't quite know how to do it, which I think again speaks to the community of practice kind of recommendation from earlier. But it still does create a logistical challenge when you know it's out there, but may not know how to go about making it happen. I don't have an answer to that, but it strikes me as a plausible problem folks could run into.
Yeah, yeah, that's absolutely true. And that also means that, we uh we I think in this sort of quickly evolving world with new data opportunities and data analysis opportunities, we also need to think about what are our sort of, in a sense, professional communities or infrastructures, and so imagine if you were educated as an anthropologist 15 years ago, and now you're employed in a company and do say studies of users or different parts of the company, whatever the local context and so on, and then suddenly you want to explore these methods, then it's a question of, how do you figure it out for yourself online, or who do you connect with? Are there courses? Are there communities online or offline? So somehow this constant growth of methods and data opportunities also needs to be somehow there needs to be some kind of infrastructure, for lack of a better word, for how to get those knowledge opportunities out to professions of various sorts. So it's of course, if for us in the Techno-Anthropology lab, it's a luxury to have to be amongst colleagues who have a variety of skills, and where you can get help and talk about these things, and including all the methodological issues. But but if you're working in a different context, it's more of a challenge to figure out how to use these opportunities. So I think that's yeah, that's something to be worked on various fronts.
Very quick follow-up to that. Let's say you don't have a community of practice you can rely on for whatever reason. Maybe
Mm.
you're a team of one somewhere. Have any thoughts on how you can figure out what might be the next best method to build a bottom-up approach, right? If you don't know what you don't know, how can you go figure it out?
Um, to be honest, I don't have a good answer to that. I think it's a great question, and but I mean, I think the only, I mean, what do we do when we don't know what we don't know? I think we seek inspiration. We come across people who have done stuff that reminds us of something that we might do ourselves. So I think there is maybe merit in of course, sharing examples of, if we're talking about anthropologists. I know you're very interested in how the anthropological profession is developing in the US. I mean, how can you articulate good examples, interesting examples, accessible examples of how you might work to expand your reflection of things by using various types of data and media? So I think good old stories, good old style sharing of stories, including sharing of personally almost like painful difficulties and stories, like I tried to write in the article about, I just got stuck and struck by how vague my own formulations were. So I think that kind of, to circulate those kinds of things could be helpful.
Yeah, no, and very much appreciate you sharing that again. Anyone want to jump in? Put it in chat. We can call it out if you prefer. And I
So
will.
maybe I can also share another story about this article, which is that um which is that I went to a party with some friends a somewhat big party. And then I ran into some people from the psychology department. And and they told me that actually sort of an article related to this, not so much methods focused, but more on what my conception of the psychologist, that they actually had that they were new to the psychology department, and someone had suggested them to read that article as sort of an insight to what is going on in this department. And I thought I was very happy to discover that my account of them is given to partial outsiders as a way to explain what is going on in that department. So that was really I was very pleased to discover that. And another background story I can tell is that that Morten Nissen, the guy who was featured here and heading this research group that were trying to do this gradual renewal of conceptual repertoire. In contrast to the cognitive psychologist, he after this project he ended up getting so frustrated that he couldn't get a professorship, so he moved to a different university where he's now a professor. And as a part of that has been sort of a major sort of upheaval and lots of student protests within the department about sort of his style of doing sort of, you could say, engaged psychological research compared to the more laboratory style of research. And the students have been very frustrated that sort of that his style of doing research has been losing ground in the department. So it's also I also ran into to deep entrenched internal conflicts in the psychology department as a part of this study.
I guess I have maybe one last one, and then maybe we'll go to closing. So just prior to that story, you did share, one of the reasons why you wrote this article to share those frustrations and to help sort of just instruct others in many ways, help others learn and grow. And so it strikes me that, for those in STS, like seeing that production of knowledge will be sort of quite normative, but that's not necessarily normative for all fields. And so in writing this, even though you were amongst, like-minded folks, probably in terms of reviewers and many and users of the paper, but nevertheless, in writing it, was there anything that you struggled with, should you say it? Should you not say it? Did you struggle with being so blunt and honest about your frustration? Any guidance that you might give to somebody else who wants to write a similarly instructive paper?
Well, I mean, the writing of this paper I think, was almost a bit like a horror story. I mean, because if the time between the first day of fieldwork and the publication is like almost 10 years. It's crazy because so I did the fieldwork and then I sort of had the new job of heading the Techno-Anthropology research group. So I got engulfed engaged in all sorts of other projects. So this has been sort of a side project, but a pet project for many years. And a first version of this, I think I sent to Big Data and Society. They didn't like it. And then I sent it, I forgot, some other journal. They also didn't like it. And I got variable feedback. And then I ended up in this qualitative inquiry. And I think a part of it was both sort of a question of figuring out how do I craft my story, but also especially relating to this mixed methods literature, which was like a huge elephant in the room everywhere, that it was difficult to say that or to explain how was this not just the same as something that there was an endless amount of literature about. So, and then I think another thing that was difficult to figure out is, I mean, how much should it be sort of this is both a conceptual piece saying something about types of integration or quantitative problems, and it's also the story about field work, and it's also a story about extracting from that the slalom method and explaining that and to get that into to 10,000 words was quite a struggle because there was a lot. Yeah, so what I decided quite early on was that because I love this field work I did with psychologists, and I loved making this connection to the Techno-Anthropology lab. So I just decided that I wanted to stick with this paper for as long as it took. So I was doing other things, writing other papers, but I always having this on the side as a little pet project for many years, and then it eventually came out. But it's not recommendable to sit on a paper for that long. I'm not sure, or at least it's not practical. So it's took an enormous amount of time to write this in many iterations. But perhaps many iterations is what it is about at the end of the day. So yeah, so there you have it.
Appreciate that. You take us out.
Thank you, Torben. I will start with just an erratum, which plays into the time it took, because the paper is actually from 2022, and I said 24, and I was wrong in my notes. It's just because Google Scholar is wrong, and I use Google Scholar to find a potentially good link. So Scholar is wrong. You took 2 less years than I said to publish that paper. Sorry for that. I know it's been so long. Thank you very much. I will close the session. Thank you, everybody, for this excellent discussion. Our next seminar will be on next Wednesday, and it will be about sensing data. See you there.